Hey, I've come up to Snoqualmie Summit to try and find the first snows of the year, and here they are. There's a good foot of snow on the ground up here. Won't be long before all the skiing will start. All right, what better place is there to talk about the World of Warcraft? And specifically where I want to start with the World of Warcraft is some idea of how it works. But we have some introductory material to get through, some kind of context to lay before I can really get into the details of how World of Warcraft works. Where I'd like to start is with this idea of a taxonomy of online gaming. Now the word taxonomy really means a hierarchy. It means an outline of concepts. And I'm sure that people who know gaming will argue with this taxonomy. And in fact, that's a lesson in taxonomy right there, that the ways we describe things are a matter of debate. There's no one single way to categorize things. But that's what a taxonomy is. It's a categorization. It's a hierarchy that puts all the terms that you're interested in into some sort of outline. Okay, so we have the first-person shooter games, which are in a separate category altogether. We have the strategy games, and among the strategy games, the two major divisions that we're going to talk about is the multiplayer online game, and that's about enough for that. We won't really talk about that again. And the massively multiplayer online games. Those are the huge ones, and of course, World of Warcraft is in there. So among those, among the massively multiplayer online games, we have the RPGs, the role-playing games. So there we have it, MMO, Massively Multiplayer Online RPG, role-playing games. And just in that name, you can get a feeling for what they do. They're massive, they're huge, lots and lots and lots of players, so they're just like the other applications we've studied. They're enormous, they're going to require lots of servers, they're going to be lots of processing power, and really high sophisticated technology. And RPG, which means that you take on a persona, you take on a kind of person, and you play that person throughout the game. And we know that because it's one of these MMOs, there's a world involved, you're traversing terrain, etc., etc. Okay, so just in this, and the example, obviously, that we're going to study is World of Warcraft. Diablo is another example of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Okay, so just in this taxonomy, you get a feeling for the overall world that we're in, the overall domain we're in, and what particularly we're going to study. Something that's got a persistent world, you move through that world, lots and lots of players interacting all the time, so it's got a very big social component, which we'll talk a little bit about. And the basic motif, the basic idea is you move through that world, playing a role, and of course, you know the rest, you do battle, right? You win victories, and you know that gives you points, and that scales you up in the levels, and that makes you Now, I won't spend a lot of time giving you the sort of the rule playing and how do you play World of Warcraft. That's really not necessary for what we want to know. We're not here to learn how to play the game. However, if you need to kind of get a feeling for the game, you feel like you're getting lost a little bit, you need a little bit more of the vocabulary, I'd suggest you go to this site. It's a very good introduction to the World of Warcraft. Starts from zero, so if you don't know anything about it, gives you almost all the vocabulary that we'll use in this segment. And so if you feel like you're getting lost, this is a really good place to go. Okay, so you can read this little introduction. It basically says more or less what I've said, that it's a role-playing game. You move through worlds, you defeat bad guys, and you get more and more skill levels as you go along. The first way for us to look at World of Warcraft technically is to do the same thing we've done for our other applications and look at the basic architecture and recognize that once again we have three tiers. We have a presentation tier, a processing tier, and a data tier. And this time we're going to go one level deeper. So I've introduced you to that concept before. We've talked about it in other applications. Now let's get into it in a little bit more detail and talk more specifically about what's going to happen at each of these layers. This will help you understand in general the idea of online gaming, but more particularly and more to my desire, to get you to understand more the whole idea of this architecture and what happens and what can happen in a processing layer, what can happen in a presentation layer, and what can happen at a data layer. In order to understand World of Warcraft, we're going to have to talk about the concepts of thin and thick clients. Thin client pretty much equals browser. Not the only kind of a thin client, but for our purposes, mainly it is a browser. Thin client browser. World of Warcraft is very different. World of Warcraft uses a thick client, a fat client. A client meaning a program. Now when I say client, it's a program running on your home computer, running on your personal computer. It's a thick client, meaning a lot happens. It's a really big program. It's a sophisticated program. It's 10 gigabytes of stuff that downloads onto your hard drive before you can even begin to play. Now, why is that? We'll talk about it in a moment. But I want you to first get this contrast between the thin client, that's a browser, where most everything is happening on the on the server, and you're just getting sort of a view into the server. It's kind of a dumb program, doesn't do much by itself, and the thick client that does a lot by itself. So the presentation layer of World of Warcraft is in this thick client. The thick client, the program that you download from Blizzard, that's the guys who make Warcraft, that you download from Blizzard and run on your home computer, is doing a lot of processing and is completely responsible for rendering, for showing your user experience. Your user experience of World of Warcraft is given through this fat client. And that fat client is the same as the presentation layer. Okay, lots of terminology going round and around here, and I want you to kind of sort it out. Presentation layer, for the sake of World of Warcraft, is the fat client. The client is a program that runs on your computer, and World of Warcraft is a fat one. It's a really big client. It does a lot of things and provides this very rich user experience. Okay, so we're bringing together lots of the concepts of the class and giving you ways of integrating that stuff and coming to kind of the real goal of this class, which is to be able to talk in a sophisticated way about all these applications that you run into. Okay, presentation layer for World of Warcraft equals thick client. Client is a program that runs on your computer and provides the user experience. Okay, let's talk about specifically that thick client, that presentation tier of World of Warcraft and what it's responsible for doing. So first of all, I think I'm sure you have this idea that when you are playing World of Warcraft, when you're experiencing World of Warcraft, it's kind of like you're inside of a movie, right? There's terrain, there's people moving back and forth, they're doing things, there's action going on, there's sound going on, all sorts of dynamic things going on. All the presentation of that is supplied by that thick client. So the display of a map. World of Warcraft happens in an imaginary territory. That territory is all mapped out. The display and management of that map, where you are, what direction you're heading, what kind of territory you are, what the territory is named, all the terrain, all that stuff is inside that thick client. So no wonder it has to be 10 gigabytes of download just to get started. That's a lot of stuff. It's also managing all the animations. If you really break it down, you'll see, or you can easily imagine this, that the World of Warcraft is just a bunch of pictures that are animated in certain sequences. And for example, when you kill a monster, the monster goes through the death sequence, set sequence that is like a little movie that plays there, right? The thick client, the fat client, the presentation layer of World of Warcraft is responsible for finding that animation, putting it in the right place on the screen, integrating it into the rest of the background, etc., etc. A lot of work there, right? A lot of processing power, which is why something like the World of Warcraft requires a pretty decent computer in order to run, as opposed to Facebook, which could run on your phone. You're never going to run, at least not in this life, going to run World of Warcraft on your phone because your phone doesn't have enough horsepower. Maybe years before a phone is powerful enough to run something like World of Warcraft. Okay, all the special effects that happen, your movement, when you move around, that's all managed by the thick client. All the dress and display of the characters, so you have a character, you make a certain character, you put certain clothes on them, you give them certain armor and weapons, etc., and that's all managed by the client as well. All your configuration is managed by the client. When you set up the ways your hotkeys, a hotkey is a key that you press to make some function happen in World of Warcraft, right? That's all set up on the computer. Your character, the hair color you choose for your character, the facial characteristics, the gender, all that stuff is all set up on your fat client. And it also stores your current status. There's a lot of information stored on your hard drive, like for example, what your current skill level is, what your inventory of objects that you're carrying around on, all that stuff is stored on your client. It's also stored on the server in the data layer, which we'll get to later, but it's also, in addition, it's cached. Remember that term? Cache is a copy. The master copy of all that stuff lives up on the server, but you don't want to be talking to the server every time you need to see that stuff. It's stored, it's cached locally also on your hard drive. Okay, and then communication. The client can't run alone. You can imagine that, right? World of Warcraft is many people all interacting simultaneously, so you can't just play on your own computer with nobody else. Anyway, nobody does. And so a lot of communication happens through that fat client as well. A lot of communication happens through the application that's downloaded onto your hard drive. And that communication is constantly telling the server what's going on, what you just did, what keys you pressed, where you're going, what things what things you're doing, and then receiving communication back from the server that says, oh, and this is what everybody else is doing, this is the impact of what you just did. Okay, so your client is telling the server what's going on. The server is saying what effect does that have? What impact does that have on the other players that are playing around you, as well as the game, as well as things that are in your store, your inventory, your backpack, as they call it in Warcraft, etc. Okay, so you got that idea? Presentation, configuration, and communication. Those are the big things that's happening, and you can imagine of those three, the one that takes the 10 gigabytes of download really is the presentation. And that's really, you know, that's the most immediately apparent part of World of Warcraft, is the richness of the user experience and the graphicalness of the user experience. Okay, that's the presentation layer. Now let's look at the processing layer. Oh, did I say layer here? No, tier, sorry. I've been saying layer. I've really been meaning to say tier all this time. The presentation tier, and now the processing tier. There's two different kinds of servers that we want to talk about in the processing tier. The first one is called the login server, and that's the first server that you interact with in World of Warcraft. This is not uncommon for other systems as well. The idea is that you go to a gateway server. Now remember, a server is just a computer that's connected to the internet. In this case, it's got some software from World of Warcraft on it, or if we were some other, you know, online service, it would have software from that service. And in this processing tier, and on the login server is part of the processing tier. It's part of the things that have to happen in order to make the system go, right? That's the processing tier. Presentation tier is about display. Processing tier is about the logic and the algorithms and all the computation that goes on for the application. And then the data tiers we'll talk about later is obviously for storing the information of the application. Okay, so this processing tier breaks into two parts. First part is the login server. The login server is where you go first. It's the gateway to the application. So you might imagine that you type in your password and name into that login server, right? It then retrieves your account information, says, yeah, you're okay to go, and then it directs you. It also downloads patches in a system like Warcraft. Constantly new parts are coming out. Whatever you downloaded last week is probably out of date, and there's some new software that has to come down and replace some of the old software. And so these patches are bits and pieces of software that come down and replace certain bits and pieces of your current system. So the login server is responsible for that as well. Validates your account, logs you in, gets back your account information, downloads patches, and then directs you to the server that you're really going to interact with most, called the game server. Okay, so game server, or as I called it here, the world server. They call them world servers because they are responsible for a world. It's the world of Warcraft, right? The world is that immersive graphical user experience where you move through territory. And so each of these territories exists on one or more servers that are called the world servers. So what does the world server do? First of all, it's part of the processing tier, right? The processing tier is the algorithms, the logic, the computation. The login server is one part, a relatively simple part. The world server or the game server is a more sophisticated part that really has all the logic. So what does it do? It manages your world. It manages you in interaction with all the other characters that happen to be in your portion of the world at this moment. It allows you, it kind of, you might say, it carries the rules of the game. So what happens when you attack a monster? What happens when you pick up an item off the ground? What happens when you trade with somebody else? What happens when the monster dies and you loot the monster? You get back all of these goodies from the monster's death. All of those things are managed on the server. So one thing you can imagine is that it's not very good. They wouldn't want to put all those rules on your local hard drive, because if they could, then for one thing they have to keep updating them, but for another thing, you know, the people who play World of Warcraft are no dummies. They'd go in and they would hack the software on their computer and they would change the rules so that they get all the benefits, right? And they don't have to do anything, and they can fly around killing anybody they want because they have the rules right there on their computer, and they can figure out a way of circumventing those rules. So the rules never make it down to your computer, so you can't mess with them. The rules stay on the server. And they're the logic of the interaction. We'll talk tons and tons and tons as we go on about that logic of interaction or those algorithms. But for now, understand that that's where they live. They live on the world server. They do maintenance things like check if you're still online, did your connection go down, they help you communicate with other users. They do all of these things to manage your experience. They also, the game servers, also control all of the objects and creatures that are not being controlled by people. So the world of Warcraft, that world, is populated by people who are in control of avatars, you might call them, or characters. and also characters or avatars or images or animations, whatever you want to call them, that are not controlled by players, and they come in two varieties. The helpful kind, which are called non-player controlled characters, and the bad guys, right? The creeps, they call them in other games, and those are called in World of Warcraft terminology mobs, mobile bad guys. I'm not exactly sure mobile what's, but they're mobile bad guys, and they're controlled by these game servers that tell them what to do, that tell them how they interact. Okay, so the game server itself also has some storage. It has what might be called a RAM cache. RAM is random access memory. If you may not be familiar with this, I don't want to dwell on it, but you have a hard drive, right? Your hard drive is persistent long-term memory on your computer, and RAM, random access memory, is what's going on right now. You don't want to go back and forth to the hard drive for operations that are really quickly, or that operate really quickly, that need a fast turnaround. You want to go to the RAM. The RAM is the memory. It's memory just like hard drive memory, but it's temporary memory. It's dynamic memory. It's memory that you can use on the fly very quickly to do quick things. And so we have a cache as well in the RAM of the world servers. All the most important information, like you're in the middle of a battle with 5 other players and things are flying back and forth, has to happen really quickly. Microseconds really matter in those cases. That information would be held in RAM. And then when there's something to be stored long term, like for example you go up a level or something like that, then it would go to the long-term storage on the data server. Okay, so far we talked about the presentation layer. The presentation layer is that fat client that you download from Blizzard and controls the rendering of your user experience. There is the processing tier that has login servers that are your gateway, and world or game servers that control the flow of the game and communicate back to your fat client to tell you what's going on, and also have the rules of the game and also control all of the characters that are not personally controlled. And then finally, we have the data layer. We talked before about relational databases, and finally we're to a place where relational databases are really used, because the transactions, believe it or not, aren't of the volume and aren't of the speed that require them to go outside of a relational database. So we'll talk a lot about, not the actual, because I couldn't never find the actual relational database structure of World of Warcraft, but I can get pretty close and I can show you more or less what they must be doing in one way or another. So that data tier consists of a relational database running on lots and lots of servers that contain your data. What's your character, what's your name, all the stuff about your account, what's your current level, what's in your inventory, all the stuff you can think about when you turn off your computer and you go away from this game, you come back and it puts you right back exactly where you were, in the status that you had, at the level that you had, with all the gear that you've collected, you know, all the items you've collected, all that kind of stuff, all your current abilities, etc., etc., etc. Where is that stored? Where is that persistently stored? It's kept on your hard drive for convenience, but it's persistently stored in the database, in the data tier of the MMO, of the massively multiplayer role-playing game, in this case World of Warcraft. Okay, so typical tier model, and nothing hard about that. We have the presentation tier, fat client, we have the processing tier, which has the login servers and the world servers, and we have the data tier that's running a very large and robust relational database that takes care of not only storing your information, but it also has the information model, right? The kinds of information that we store, the types of information that we store, the attributes of those information, the value patterns of that information, etc., is all there in that database, in that data store. So it's the information model and the organization of the information, all the user data, all the stuff that you stored, as well as all the game data. There's all sorts of things that need to be known. We'll see a lot of them in particular later, but you can imagine that there's lots of data, like what are the names of all of the places? Right? All that's data that has to be stored somewhere, and it's all stored in a data layer. What are the descriptions of all the different attacks that you can make? What are the different abilities? What are the different parameters of all the different abilities? All that stuff has to be stored. That's a huge model of game information that we'll talk about later, but it all has to be stored, and it gets stored in that data layer. Okay, so you got the idea? Typical 3-tier architecture: presentation layer, processing layer, data layer. All right. Now, we're going to get into the gameplay in a moment, but let me discuss one other thing before we do, and that's the social networking part of the World of Warcraft. Lots of people playing simultaneously. Now, one way to think about social networks is along the parameter of how long does your relationship last with the people around you. And so I've organized the different things that happen in World of Warcraft along these lines. Now what I'm going to do, and especially if you're a person who has played World of Warcraft a lot, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to make the things that you've seen over and over again and never really thought about strange to you and new to you, and give you a way of looking at them that allows you to take your knowledge of World of Warcraft and apply it in general to things that are going on. Frankly, World of Warcraft is not, it's not the most important thing going on to me. It may be to you, but it's not to me. What's important to me are the concepts from World of Warcraft that apply equally well to all sorts of things. And to give you an attitude towards World of Warcraft, especially if you played it before, that will allow you to use your knowledge creatively in other realms. Now, if you haven't played World of Warcraft before, you can use this as a way of, can I figure out what's going on in World of Warcraft without having to be a player, without having to go through years and years of struggle? And I can tell you from personal experience, because I never really have played World of Warcraft, believe it or not. I mean, I'm talking about it, all this stuff, but I'm not a World of Warcraft player. I've played for, all of maybe an hour and a half in my entire life. But I've used the skills that I have in analysis of systems, and specifically in this idea of the tier architecture and the structure of information, and what we'll talk about in a moment, algorithms and functionality and all that kind of stuff, to decode World of Warcraft and to understand it in a way that, frankly, most players don't understand it. Most players are completely ignorant of exactly what's going on behind the scenes. By understanding what's going on behind the scenes, as a player, as a person who's never played before, you can totally understand the idea of Warcraft and be able to talk about Warcraft at a much deeper level than the people who are experienced players. Now, obviously, they're going to know a lot of stuff that you don't, but in fact, you'll know some stuff that they don't. Okay, so World of Warcraft social network. In order from most persistent, in other words, this relationship has the longest life, to relationships that have the shortest life, here's how it goes. At the very top of the hierarchy, the thing that you belong to forever, basically at least one character that you own belongs to forever, is called a faction. A faction you might think of like as a nation. It's the largest group of people. When you start, you go right into that faction and your character stays in that faction forever. Then you can belong to these things called guilds. Guilds are long-term associations between people, and they are your peers. They're people that you're going to play with over and over and over again. So when you become part of a guild, you're saying this is a club that I'm going to stay in for a while, generally speaking. And then there's two kinds of groupings that you group in temporarily. When you're with them, you're really together with those people, but then after a short period of time, it's gone. And the first one is a raid. And a raid has lots and lots of people. There are tons of people, 20, 30, 40 people who all get together to perform a quest, to perform a mission, basically, not a quest exactly, to perform a mission, a goal all together. And then there are groups. The groups are a small number of people, 4 or 5 people that get together to do a similar thing, maybe to attack a monster that they couldn't attack alone. Okay, so that's the idea. And then and for the shortest life, or the shorter life, at least in terms of your interaction, is your friends list. You have a whole list of friends, but you're not playing with those friends all the time. Not like in Facebook. In Facebook, your list of friends are your world. They're who you hang out with. In World of Warcraft, you're likely to be hanging out with these guilds and groups, and your friends are just kind of around, and when you want to be in joint action with them, you'd bring them into a guild or a group. Or, excuse me, you bring them into a group or a raid, or you join the same guild. Okay, so you have this long list of friends. Sometimes you group up with them. Mostly you're not grouped up with them. And then the shortest is random people you just happen to run into. Run into a person, you happen to be at the same place in the same time. You ask them some advice. They ask you some advice. You have a short conversation and you move on. Okay, that's the nature of the social network in World of Warcraft. Very different, excuse me, than the social network inside of Facebook. Very different. Facebook is really friend-focused. And World of Warcraft, while you're likely to be playing with your friends or you're likely to become friends with these people, it's really group focused. It's focused on the groups of people who have a common purpose to get to a common goal. And that's really the nature of the social relationship there. So it's much more sort of like, you might think of it more like a business relationship. The social network inside of World of Warcraft is more like, we're all here to get something done, let's work together, and then when that's over, I may or may not see you again. Okay, now I want to go into a subject that's going to last us quite a while and is going to take us through quite a bit of of the rest of the material on World of Warcraft. Excuse me. And that idea is the example of processes and algorithms. So remember what an algorithm is. I'll go over it in just a second again. But we're going to try and take apart World of Warcraft not as an end user would, not as a person who's trying to play, but as an architect would. And remember, I've tried to give you this attitude throughout the entire class that what we're trying to do is see how are these things put together? How are they made? Let's look behind the covers. Let's look at the social issues that are behind these things. Look at the technology that makes these things. Look at the information that they handle. And that's going to give us insight into these systems that goes far beyond the insight that end users have. Not again to disparage the insight of end users, but to augment that and to give you a perspective to look at applications that's very different than an end user perspective. Okay, so what is an algorithm again? Well, I have a kind of a fun one here. That's where should you post your status, and it's kind of topical, right? It's and this was pointed to me by a student, so thank you very much. I didn't note your name here. I really should have noted your name. And if you ping me and give me your name, I'll put your name on this slide for the next time that I happen to record this lecture. So this is just a fun little algorithm, and you get the idea. There's some question, and then there's a yes and a no. So the first question is, do you want anybody to actually read it? If the answer is no, post on Google+, right? That's just kind of a little ding against Google+. But maybe it's yes. Are you in a bar? And if the answer is yes, then and you want somebody to read it, right? So we've answered these two questions, then post it on Foursquare. And you can go across this entire diagram. It's a kind of a fun thing to follow through. But what it gives you is it gives you this idea of an algorithm. An algorithm is a determined process that leads you from where you begin to where you need to end. And in this case, where you need to end is posting a status. Where you begin is you have some post, right, that you want to make, some status update that you want to make, and this process will lead you through to the decision. That's an algorithm. And we're going to look at all sorts of algorithms inside of World of Warcraft. And the reason we're going to do that is because if you understand the algorithms, you're going to understand World of Warcraft, and you're going to understand it in this deep way. Okay, so I'm going to work my way down through a high-level process and algorithm, a medium-level process and algorithm, and a low-level process and algorithm. Now, I'll warn you ahead of time that when we start getting to these algorithms, things are going to get kind of thick. You know, they're logical things. There's lots of they're logical processes. They can be very complex. I've tried to boil them down to as simple as possible, but you're really going to have to sit and scratch your head in order to do what I did, which was take this paragraph, which is pretty easy to understand and get a picture of, and boil it down to the mechanical actions that the computers take, and specifically the client, the server, and the data layer, right? And so we'll work through these in turn. But I want you to get prepared that we're going deep now, and we're going pretty technical. And this is pretty much as technical as this class ever gets. But it is, you know, for some of you, it's going to be more technical than you've needed to go before. Okay. High-level process. You log in, right? You enter that login server. You download patches. We talked about that. You materialize somewhere in the world. You move around, you fight, you collect stuff, and your display changes. Your world changes. Your little animation, your characters change, showing the effect of these actions, as well as the actions of other players, right? That's the high-level experience. That's exactly what's happening at the highest level. Log in, download, materialize, move around, fight, collect up stuff, and your display, your readout, your user experience updates to show the results of all of those actions. Okay, pretty simple, and that describes that at that level. We've described almost every game of this ilk. All right, but now let's get down to the details. So this is the algorithm, and you'll see that there's a little bit more to dig into. There's a little bit more to chew on in this algorithm than there was simply in the text description. But this is what's happening. So notice the key. We have the player's machine, right? That's the fat client on the player's machine. We have the login server, we have the game server, and we have the data server. So we have the presentation tier, that's the player machine, the processing tier, that's the login server and the game server, and we have the data tier, which is in the data server. Okay? All right, so on the player's machine, we log in. That's happening from the fat client. The fat client communicates to what? The login server. And the login server validates you, and in order to validate you, it has to make a round trip into the green thing, which is the data server. So it goes into the database, pulls out your account information, and that validates you. Maybe your password didn't match and you never get past that stage, but your password does match. It sends patches. It determines what patches you need, instead of sending patches, and then it redirects you to the game server, One thing I left out here is there should probably be a line back from patches back to the client computer, back to your machine that says we've downloaded the patches, right? So I left out a line there, so you can imagine a line from patch back to your computer that says download the patches. So we validate you, we download the patches, we redirect, and what do we redirect to? We redirect to the blue game server. What does the blue game server do? It updates the client. The client is the player's machine. And it updates the player, like what your current status is, the map, and whatever other objects are around on the ground. And in order to figure that out, it too has to make a round trip. It has to make a query. It asks a question of the database, gets back data about you, sends all that data back to your computer, and your computer updates its display, it updates the character, it updates the world, that you know where you are on the map, etc. It updates all those objects, and now you're ready to go. Okay, so can you see this process? This is kind of the startup process. First we go to the login server, which is going to the database. Then it redirects us. That means it passes us along to the game server, and the game server also goes to the database to get data about you, and it updates your client machine to say, okay, when you materialize, here's where you're going to materialize, here's all the items that you own, here's what's happened since you were gone, other people are moving around, etc., etc. Okay, and then, and this is a big then, you do stuff. Right? You move around, you fight, you collect items, you trade with people, you communicate with them, etc., etc. And as you do that, it updates the server. So it communicates back to the server, and now the server also is saying, well, you did that, but a bunch of other people are doing that as well, and it updates you. So this little loop here, can you see a loop there? The arrow going from the machine, from the game server to your computer, the client machine, the fat client, to back around, round and around and around as you do stuff, and as other people do stuff. As other people do stuff, they're also updating the server, and so the server turns around and updates you. Okay, and so in this little box here you have a little quote. It's not uncommon for the client and server to, for the client to give its position, its updates to the server 10 times a second. So that's how fast this loop is going. It's going round and round and round. You're communicating to the client, or you're communicating to the server, server's communicating to your client, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth really quickly. The more quickly it can communicate, the more seamless all of that interaction is going to be, right? You press the forward button and you want to move forward immediately. Now that pretty much happens only on your local system, which we'll see in a moment, but how about people moving towards you? Is that guy heading straight for you, or is he going to turn before he gets to you? That's all dependent on how fast his computer is updating the server and how fast the server is updating your computer. Okay, get the idea? That's the high-level play algorithm. I log in, I get passed on to the game server, and then I go into this loop. This is called a loop, round and round and round. I go into this loop of I update the server from stuff that I do on my local computer. The server updates me from stuff that happened on other people's local computers, as well as what was the impact of something I did. For example, I fight a creature, a mob. I fight a bad guy, and the server calculates what the effect of that is, transmits it back to my computer so that I can update what my current status is. Okay, that's a high-level algorithm. Let's now dive down into a medium-level algorithm. So at the mid-level, here's kind of how play proceeds. I get my bearings, that is, I look around, I change the angle of my character so that I'm looking around, see where I am, kind of check on my status, I get my bearings, I move around a little bit, I check my map, and so I know where I'm going, I know where I am, I know where I have to proceed to next. I check my backpack. My backpack is my inventory of all the little items that I've collected along the way. And then I start off on a quest. A quest in World of Warcraft is a mission. You have to accomplish some goal, and that's as much as you really need to know about a quest. You're trying to accomplish a goal with your character, sometimes in conjunction with other characters, sometimes alone. Okay, you confront a mob. That's this mobile creature. That's a bad guy, a creep. It's what the game produces in order to put an obstacle in your way. And then you defeat them. You engage in ability. This is something that you have, some method of attacking, or some way that you have, and I don't want to be any more specific than that. You engage in ability, which means that you turn on something that you have, something you're able to do, and that defeats the mob, that defeats the bad guy, and you win. Okay, get the idea? That's the mid-level process. That's the process of playing World of Warcraft at the mid-level. At the high level, we talked about you just log in and then you do stuff. Now we're talking more specifically about some of the stuff that you do. You're moving around, you're attacking, you're doing things that you need to do in order to gain your goal. All right, so that's at the mid-level. Now let's look at the the algorithm for the mid-level play. Okay, so remember again, we have the player's computer, which is the client. We have the login server, which is no longer in the picture, right? The login server is out of the picture. We're done with the login server. We have the game server and the data server. So the game, it's really now, it's a matter of you communicating with the game server and the game server communicating with the data server when it needs to. Okay, so I'll draw your attention to one other little piece here. In big is you, your personal computer, but up in the corner, in a series of small copies of your computer are a bunch of other people who are doing the same thing at the same time, right? So everybody's communicating with this game server all simultaneously, and so you need to take that into account as well. Okay, so now here's the algorithm. Here's the way of thinking about this more mechanically. I gave you the story form. Let's talk about the form that is that's more mechanical. So the first thing that happens is your client detects some action that you did. It's something that you did, some keystroke, something. And it could be anything from engaging an ability, moving around, communicating with somebody, pointing to the enemy that you want to capture, or sorry, pointing to the enemy that you want to defeat, picking up something that the enemy dropped. All those different things are all actions. First thing your client has to do is detect the action, and having detected what you did, update your display immediately so you get no lag at all between, for example, moving a foot forward and actually going forward through space. Then it updates your display. First thing it does is detect what you did. Second thing it does is figure out what the impact of what you did was. Third thing it does is display changes to your client's application that reflect the things that you did. Then it'll update the local cache. So the local cache, remember, is your storage of the global information, your information like what your position is or whatever on your local hard drive. And then you may very well just go and do that again, right? That's kind of a loop that you take. So your client computer is constantly going through this loop. Detect the action, figure out what to do about it, update the display, make any changes to the data on your local computer. Round and round and round in a loop. That's what your client computer is doing. However, it also sends updates at the same time to the server, because every action that you take has to be communicated up to the server so that it knows what you're doing in relation to the rules of the game, as well as what you're doing in relation to other players of the game. So what does the server do? You made an action, you sent a message about that action to the server. The server now receives that update. So from you, it got an update of what you did. You engaged. Let's just say you moved forward one step. It calculates changes, so it's figuring out, okay, he moves forward one step. What does that mean? Now where is he? Now where is he in relation to creatures? Is he close enough to attack a creature, etc., etc.? Updates the cache storage, so it's updating its local storage. It also updates the database. So it may have to store, now I know this is getting a little confusing with all the places things are stored, but think about it as a bunch of copies that are useful in the near term. And the only one that ultimately is going to matter is the one on the database. You have a cache, a copy on your local hard drive to make things fast on your computer. You have a cache, a copy on the gaming server to make things happen fast on the gaming server. And you have the permanent record on the database. So it may or may not need to update the database, but if it does, it's going to update the database. And so that gets data and it sends data to the database. And then it updates you. It updates your client. It updates your machine with what's going on now. What are other people in your vicinity doing? What's that mob, that creature that you're attacking doing, etc., etc. And then notice it goes back to your computer, and your computer is also going to calculate changes to display based not only on what you did, but on what all the other characters that are around you did and what the environment around you is doing. And then you'll go back through updating the display, updating the local cache, and then sending status to the server. So this is another loop going round and round and round. Your own computer, your own local computer is doing this loop, going round and round and round, observing your behavior and making changes, but it's also sending the results of those changes back up to the server, and then the server is updating you, and you're updating based on what's happening on the server. Kind of complicated, right? Kind of sophisticated. And don't forget, up in the corner here, meanwhile, everybody else is doing that as well. So this server is just going crazy, keeping track of everybody's changing everything that they've done and keeping them up to date on what everybody else has done. So to a large extent, this shows that the game server is like a switchboard. It's getting in all these messages and it's passing out all these other messages. But between getting and passing it out, it's also calculating changes. It's calculating, oh, did you just die? Did the creature you're attacking just die? Do you now have more things in your backpack? Have you just moved up a level? Are you now, able to do things that you weren't able to do before? So it's not only just sending and receiving, it's also calculating in the middle and then updating all the machines. Okay? High-level algorithm, where there's just a loop going between you and the client machine, you and the server, your client and the server. A little mid-level where we see both the interaction of your local computer on itself and the interaction with the server. So we've zoomed in a little bit. And now we're going to zoom into a final level, a low-level process. The low-level process is, for example, and now you can imagine that for that high-level process, there's lots of medium-level processes, and for that medium-level process, there's a whole slew of these low-level processes, these low-level things that happen. You press a key, and your character moves. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in on that. What happens when you press a key? So we're going down and down and down, getting more and more specific, down to the level of very, very small pieces of activity inside the application. Okay, so that's what it is from a process standpoint. Not much to understand there. But what is it from an algorithm standpoint? So now we're just in that loop. We're going down to that smallest loop that's just inside your computer. We know that there's a gaming server up there, or we know that there's a game server up there. We know that there's a data server up there, but we're zoomed in to exactly what happens on your computer when you press a key. Okay, so these WASD keys, those are all movement keys. And I know for you gamers that, the keyboard is not the preferred way to do this. The mouse is the preferred way to, don't worry about that. What happens is your application, your fat client, your download from Blizzard that you're using to play the game that renders your user experience, that client is reading the keyboard. It's constantly monitoring the keyboard. Hey, what key did they press? They pressed the W key. Do this. They pressed an A key. They do this. Move them, right? And not only that key, but tons of other keys. Okay, so you press one of these movement keys, it's going to have to calculate a change in your position, right? And then immediately it's going to go back and say, okay, you got another key? Have you pressed it twice? Have you pressed it 3 times? Or you keep your finger on it so that it wants to go do as fast as the keyboard, as fast as it can take the input, you'll be getting those commands, right? So there's a little loop right there. So it's going back and reading the keyboard over and over again before it even gets through the rest of this stuff. So you read the keyboard, you calculate the change in position based on that keyboard. You add or subtract from the current position. So if I press a forward key, whoa, oh cool, a huge bunch of snow just kind of came crashing down from the roof. You probably heard that boom, 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 boom. It's great. I love being in the snow. All right. And then you update the display. You moved forward a step, it updates the display to show you that you're forward a step. You kept your finger on that forward button, and it makes you come fast towards the in the forward direction. Okay? So every few milliseconds, that's every few thousandths of a second. In other words, almost 1,000 times a second, 300-400 times a second, it's going through this loop. So it's going through this loop really, really fast. Okay, so now we're ready to dive to the deepest level. And I only want to show you this level. I don't want to dwell on it. I don't want to give you, I don't want to take you here really. I just want to show you that from this level, the next place to go is into code, right? This is programming code. This is a little bit of programming code to kind of give you a feeling. I just unearthed this code from a web search. I'm pretty sure it's ActionScript. It might be C#, but I'm pretty sure it's ActionScript, which is the script behind Flash. And I want to just point to a couple of words. This idea, can you see the word rotate circled there? And movement. This is a little piece of code. This is a piece of computer code that's specifically targeted towards what do you do when you press one of the keys that makes you turn. This is some actual code that some guy suggests you use to do this function. Okay, so we've gotten down so far that we can actually now pull the covers back the last little bit and look into the code that makes these actions happen. All right, so what have we done here? What I've tried to do is give you this idea of you can describe what happens in the game using words. You can also describe what happens in the words much more mechanically, talking about the algorithm behind the game. And when you talk about the algorithm behind the game, you're getting closer and closer and closer to being able to actually make the game. And when you get those algorithms down to the most minute level, like what happens when you press one key one time, you can then begin to translate them into computer code that will actually implement, meaning make that little function. And those little functions group up to be the bigger functions, group up to be the bigger functions, group up to be the biggest functions. That's really big point number one. This idea of breaking it down further and further and further until you get to something so small that it can be easily written in a small chunk of computer code. That's thing number one. Thing number two, and I didn't mention this really, I didn't point to it explicitly, but I mentioned it a lot, is the idea of loops. That you go round and round and round through this algorithm pretty much indefinitely. Right? As long as you're connected to World of Warcraft, it's going to go through that update my local display, update the server, server update me, update my local display, update the server, server update me. Right? That loop goes on and on and on and on and on, and all programs ultimately work that way. They have one big major loop that goes round and round and round, never stopping until you stop the application. And then within that are smaller loops and smaller loops and smaller loops and smaller loops. And those looping structures are really the thing that continues the action going. Otherwise, you'd start the program and then it would end. It would go away, and you wouldn't be able to do anything anymore, right? There's always got to be a loop to keep it going until you say stop. And when you say stop, no matter where it was in the loop, it just goes poof, gone away. Okay, so that's our introduction to World of Warcraft. Hopefully at this point, even if you've never played World of Warcraft before, you get the general idea of how Warcraft works. It's this game where you're in a world, etc., and you have some idea of the high, the medium, and the low-level algorithms that are used to make the game work.